those of you who would have been following the media would have noticed we had a federal budget last week, which is, the Australian press, there's always a lot of hoopla about the budget, but it is quite a serious statement about where we're going as a country. And in the case of this particular budget, I would argue not very well economically. But we wanted to have a discussion with people here from both the think tank world, politics, and the university sector on analysing both this budget but looking at budgets in the future. Because we are facing a situation in Australia of spiralling debt, spiralling deficits, and a problem with health and welfare, which is just getting out of control. And it looks like there aren't any solutions for it. From my perspective and the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, there are just a couple of things to note about the budget. We were quite disappointed with the budget. When Malcolm Turnbull was elected leader, he promised to govern. He promised to govern as a liberal, small government principles and institute economic reform. And I would argue we saw very little of it in the budget. But just to give you a brief summary of what we saw in this year's federal budget, there were a few good things. We did see a slight increase in the 80,000 marginal tax threshold to 87,000. The problem is, though, this comes nowhere even remotely close to dealing with the tax hike we have every year due to bracket creep. So whereas bracket creep is taking considerably more money every year from us, so in effect what was billed as a tax cut is still a tax increase, just not as much as it could have been otherwise. We also saw a graduate reduction of the corporate tax rate to 25%. The problem is that this is going to happen in 10 years. Now, if you believe that we're going to see a gradual reduction of the corporate tax rate to 25% in 10 years, as was announced, then I think you'll believe anything. So we also saw some small, other tweaks, but the problem is we still have a situation where Commonwealth debt is $500 billion. Now, this is $40,000 for every Australian household. Just think about that. Your household owes $40,000 in debt. Interest on this debt works out at $1,000 a family, a year. So $1,000 of every single one of your households a year is going to pay for this debt. Revenue has gone up, and spending has gone up both in nominal terms, in real terms, and as a percentage of GDP. And the projections that they've used are relatively unrealistic. And then we have other things in there. We have everything from passport fees being increased to the big ugly tax hikes. Trevor spoke about the public health lobby. We're now having four more tax increases on tobacco. The average pack will be over $40, and your average smoker will be paying over $7,500 a year in tobacco taxes. We also have increases in superannuation taxes. And because of the fact that we have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, companies are leaving and going offshore, where we've decided to not actually fix the corporate tax rate considerably, but rather go after multinational corporations, which I think doesn't address the real issue. But to hear from people who know far more about it than me, we have three speakers here. I'll introduce all of them now, just so that we can flow between the speakers. Firstly, we have Professor Sinclair Davidson. I think all of us would know Sinclair Davidson from many years. I think he's been the only regular speaker we've had, I think, at all 4 Friedman conferences. But he's a professor of finance at RMIT University. He's a fellow of the Institute of Public Affairs, an academic fellow of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. He blogs regularly on Cadillacsy, and we see him frequently, both in his opinion pieces, on television, in the media, smacking down the stupidity of the left. Following that, I believe we have Simon Cowan, who's the research fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies, where he's director of the Target 30 program. Target 30 at the CIS aims to reduce government spending to 30% of GDP. Which most people think is an ambitious target, whereas I would say we're just getting started. He's also very frequently in the media. I mean, Simon's media output has been phenomenal this year in particular, and in the last year, sort of advocating the case for smaller government. And his most recent report tackled the problems of the old age pension and retirement. And finally, we have the great Senator David Leyonhjelm, Senator for New South Wales, will be re-elected Senator for New South Wales shortly, I'm sure, for the Liberal Democratic Party, a previous winner of the Australian Libertarian of the Year. So without further ado, let's start with Professor Davidson.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the sponsors. This is certainly Australia's premier freedom event, and it's a magnificent job once again. So well done, guys. Thank you so much. Now, Trevor, he was just here. I loved the talk that we just had, but there were two things that I disagreed with. One was the use of jazz and music in the same sentence, which I thought was just lost me at that point, I have to say. And the other thing was about Oliver Wendell Holmes, because I always thought, I have to say, the man's obviously said many terrible things. I always thought that the worst thing that he ever said was that he liked paying income tax because that's what he bought his civilization with. Now, he was buying his civilization at the outrageous rate of 7 cents in the dollar, and I'd be more than happy to return to that status. Now, Tim has only given me 12 minutes to talk, so I won't be giving you like the 2-3 hours of fare that I would normally have given in something along these lines. But I just want to say this is probably the most terrible time to be an Australian taxpayer, because both the government and the opposition are simply working out ways how they can basically destroy the economy and farm us. And they have absolutely no principles whatsoever. And so I liked Trevor's talk about we've got to start off with some principles. So the principles that I always start off with are Adam Smith's 4 principles of taxation. The first one being that all citizens should contribute towards the government nearly as possible in proportion. Yesterday, when my good friend Adam Crichton had an article in The Australian saying progressive taxation was okay because Adam Smith said it was okay, he was actually wrong. In proportion, so Adam Smith spoke about a proportional tax. He also spoke about supporting the government, which I know for some people in this room is a bit controversial. He also then said taxes ought to be certain, not arbitrary. They should be convenient for the contributor to pay it. That is why land tax is such a tyranny. Why? Because it's not convenient for the person to pay it, Louise. You are quite wrong on this point. And Mr. Friedman too. And then finally, it should be efficient. We should take out and keep out of the pockets as little as possible, so the taxes should be efficient. Now, the very first point I thought I would just discuss very quickly is why should we pay to support the government? And that I have modestly called a Davidson Potts curve, after 2 excellent economists at RMIT University who have been doing a lot of excellent work looking at institutional features of our society by trading off disorder costs against dictatorship costs. Now, when you have high levels of disorder in a society, you have very little economic prosperity. And when you have high levels of dictatorship in the economy, you've got very little prosperity. And so the challenge when you live in civil society is to make choices which trade off the costs and benefits of disorder against the costs and benefits of dictatorship. And that traces out more or less how much economic prosperity you're going to have in the world. And it is true that Somalia is not a happy place. And one of the reasons why Somalia is not a happy place is because they don't have the rule of law, they don't have courts of law, and they have high levels of disorder. So the rule of law, courts of law, civil society costs something, and we've got to be prepared to pay for it through charity and through some levels of taxation. But then again, not too much, because how much taxation should we have? And Trevor brought up the point of public goods. There are some genuine public goods. National security to prevent from violent invasion is a public good. People immigrating here is not an invasion of the country, and if you think it is, you're pretty crazy. Okay, but violent invasion is something that we should protect against, and we've got to pay for that. So I love these matrices. So we've got a public good. Is it a public good? Yes, no. Should we use coercion, or is there coercion? Yes, no. And in the yes, yes box, we pay tax. I think we can more or less agree that it's probably reasonable. In the no coercion and it's a public good, there is going to be a free rider problem. We hear a lot about free rider problems. They are oversold. Yes, there is a free rider problem, so what? Get on with it. Then we have the private economy. No public goods and no coercion. We all understand that idea. Then we have a massively growing area in our economy called the disputed territory. The provision of things that are not public goods, that are coerced and paid for through taxation. Now, Mises, for example, says, as the Liberal sees it, the task of the state is to exclusively guarantee the protection of life, health, liberty, and private property against violent attack. Anything else is an evil, and on that basis, that disputed territory there is all evil. Buchanan, the communist, says some extensions of state power are more legitimate than others, and I think, yes, we can sort of start telling stories around there. But I just thought very quickly, very rough and ready, this number's far too big. I thought what I would do is I'll just have a look at the budget expenditure, which is in that small little box over there, and just carve out some categories. If we were to avoid the disputed territory on a very rough and ready basis, being very generous to those parasites in Canberra, how much money should the Commonwealth spend? And the maximum, or what I call the Mises maximum, is $126 billion, or 28% of current budgeted expenditure on the Commonwealth government. And that number is too high because I could even drill down into subcategories and start chucking things out. For example, I would throw out the entire Federal Health Department. But Mises said they're in, so they're in. Okay. That is 64% of personal income tax. Okay. So if we only had our current income tax at 64% of its current level and no other taxes, we would finance, more or less, that $126 billion. So we should be thinking about radically reducing the size of government. All of the rest of it is in disputed territory, and I think following on from what Trevor said, we should start disputing that territory, which we don't really do at the minute. So expenditure coming out of the budget, far, far, far too big. The big thing to my mind that came out of the budget is multinational tax propaganda. There is this fear that somewhere, somehow, somebody in Australia is not paying enough tax. And I'm sure maybe there is such a person or such a company that's not paying enough tax. It is actually not really a big problem. Nonetheless, the government announced on last Tuesday night that it will strengthen the integrity of the tax system and target tax avoidance by introducing a new diverted profits tax, which we're not allowed to call a search engine tax, Tim. But so they introduced a new tax on more or less American technology companies. Now, how this is going to operate is that if the company pays less tax than it would have in Australia, so 80% or less tax it pays in the rest of the world than what it would have paid in Australia, it is probably a tax avoider. Okay, well, the first problem with that is, of course, we've got like very high income tax rate at 30%. So any company in the region that's got a regional headquarters in Singapore is automatically targeted as being a tax avoider. This is also a form of fiscal colonialism. We are actually going around and saying to other countries how they should set their tax systems, which of course is the very basis of their own sovereignty. We should actually push back on this particular one as well. So we're going to have a whole bunch of bureaucrats basically saying, well, your transaction doesn't have enough economic substance. I mean, what does that even mean? Yeah. Or we don't agree with how you structure your company. Well, you've got to say to those people, well, start up your own technology company. You structure it differently. Do a better job than these crazy business people. So it's the most astonishing sort of substitution of values, especially bureaucratic values for entrepreneurial values. If this sort of thing could work, the Soviet Union would have survived. There is no evidence whatsoever that the company tax base in Australia is being eroded. What I've done is I've decomposed it. The red line becomes a proxy for the company tax rate, and the blue and the purple line around it are proxies for the company tax base measured differently, and what we can see is they are more or less straight lines. The tax base is not being eroded. Australia raises company tax at quite a massive rate compared to the OECD. The blue line is Australia's company tax revenue as a function of tax revenue, and the bottom graph is Australian tax revenue as a function of total tax revenue. And what we can see is Australia raises tax revenue well above rates in the rest of the OECD, largely driven by our dividend imputation system. So, as I said, I've only got 12 minutes to talk. Expenditure is far too high. Even by Australian historical standards, we are probably spending far, far too much money. Our debt levels are far too high. If you read the papers, you would have seen yesterday the federal government borrowed $7 billion to be paid back in 10 years' time. Taxes are too high, even at the levels, well beyond levels justified by the Liberal state. Even by historical, Australian historical levels, our taxes are above long-term average growth rates. So we've been taxed too much, we are spending too much. The new diverted profits tax and the superannuation tax are arbitrary. The superannuation tax is retrospective. It is going to cause trouble for the government. And of course, the last point being that most taxation is churn or charity. Charity should be a private function, not a public function, and churn should be wheedled out of the system anyway, because we're basically saying you can't trust people to spend their own money. So thank you very much.
Look, thank you very much for today's warm welcome, and to Tim for inviting me back. I mean, Sinclair this is his fourth Friedman conference, but this is my third, and coincidentally enough, it was my third consecutive budget lockup. And on Sky, the Sunday before the budget, what I said, the conclusion I came to was, this was the most important budget for a decade. After one which you can only describe as failure by the Liberal government and one absolute non-attempt to balance the budget, the government really needed to outline a coherent plan that would bring us back towards balance, that would give us an economic base from which to go forward. Well, this year, and I've got some good news, this year was better than last year from my perspective. But only because driving home last year my car broke down and I got stuck in Goulburn. I don't recommend being stuck in Goulburn. It made the budget seem that much worse. Unfortunately, the fiscal story in the budget was exactly the same, which meant, of course, that the disappointment was again the same. It's becoming a familiar feeling. Now, in the short time that I have, I'm going to try and cover four things. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the budget than Sinclair did and try and take you through some of the trends in spending and revenue, what progress, if any, we've made back towards surplus. I'm going to give a little hat tip to Clint Eastwood and look at the budget highlights and lowlights. And then I'm going to close with a very important difference that gets overlooked, and that's the difference between fiscal management and economic management. So, since Costello's last budget, Labor has delivered 6 consecutive deficits, and the Libs have now delivered 3. And this is not the only thing that the parties have in common from their recent budgets. Labor played shenanigans in 2012-13, shifting payments around, bringing the carbon tax compensation into previous years to try and manufacture a surplus. But in 2013, we saw Libs playing pin the tail on the donkey, shifting payments into the year before to try and make themselves look better and Labor look worse. What is in fact happening is that both sides are playing the taxpayers for fools. After most of a decade of surpluses, we have now seen over $350 billion in combined deficits since 2008. The most optimistic path back to budget balance sees us getting there next decade. And I would submit, on current trends and current expectations, we will never get back to balance on this budget path. Famously, the greatest treasurer in the world in 2012 stood up and said that he had delivered 4 surpluses. This was one of 15 predictions of a year that would come in surplus since 2008. The number of surpluses we have actually seen, 0. With each year, the path for budget repair slides out, and the supposed better outcomes that we're seeing from this fiscal restraint disappears into the future. And this slide shows the deterioration starkly. The rows represent budget years, with the 5 years of estimates and projections going out forward. The first row shows the 2012-13 budget with its 4 predicted surpluses. As you move down the rows, you see the blowouts in the budget. For example, if you look at the 2013 year, down the column there, you'll see in 2012 that was predicted to be a $2.6 billion surplus. The number that was actually delivered in that year was nearly a $50 billion deficit. 2016-17, this year, predicted in the first budget to be $6.6 billion. The number coming in this year, $37.1 billion in deficit. Just a $40 billion deficit. I mean, you know, what's that between friends? Government even said they were sorry, you know. can't hold them to their promises, I suppose. Here's the thing, even Wayne Swan on his good days admits that there is an issue here. The debate is not about whether we've got a budget problem, the debate is about what is causing it. Does Australia have a revenue problem or a spending problem? Well, I dare say, given you're in this room, you can predict what my conclusion on this is going to be, but we should go through the data. What we have seen, and you can see it in this little table here, is a constant prediction of massive revenue growth across the forward estimates. It's been around 2% of GDP in revenue increases for each of those 5 budgets there. Now, we haven't met those levels. Everyone accepts that. Does that mean we have a revenue problem? No, it does not. Because revenue has actually grown in every one of those budgets by 1% of GDP or more. It just hasn't met the unrealistically high expectations and the wishes of politicians who just don't want to deal with this issue. Now, in part, this is an issue caused by the difference between projections and estimates. And you can see on that previous graph, I had the brown sections. They're estimates. That's what Treasury actually thinks will happen with the economy. But the last 2 years are projections. And according to convention and the Charter of Budget Honesty, Treasury automatically assumes a return to trend, automatically boosts revenue, automatically reduces spending, and makes the budget look better than it is. It sets up this continual story of a loss of revenue. And it also gives us these figures. So the revenuistas will claim there's $40 billion of missing revenue this year, based on projections in 2013-14. However, if you look at the projections as a percentage of GDP, revenue is only just below where it was projected to be. But spending is 2% of GDP higher. It's the mechanical process that creates this illusion. It's not reality. The issue is irrevocably, undeniably, indisputably that we are spending too much. It is just too much spending. The only way to conclude the opposite is to reason backwards. If you start from the premise that spending has to go up and it can't be cut, then you've got a revenue problem, because if you don't, there's no way to balance the budget. And we see our little projections here again. In every budget, the government comes out and says spending will fall across the forward estimates. In 3 of those 5 budgets, spending went up, and I'll take a bet that the last one sees spending go up as well. Even in the supposedly harsh 2014 budget, the really harsh one, the one that Tony Abbott just cut all that spending, and wasn't it fantastic? In that budget, revenue still increased by much more than spending was cut. Politicians are trying to balance the budget on revenue, not spending. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what's driving these spending increases. Education, health and welfare spending all increased significantly in real terms from 2008 to the end of the forward estimates. When you hear about the need for Gonski reform, remember that Commonwealth education spending has gone up 45% in real terms over this period. When you hear about the need for more welfare, remember that welfare spending has gone up 43% in real terms over this period. And when someone talks about the destruction of Medicare and the cutting of these health budgets, remember that Commonwealth health spending alone is up 31% in real terms, all during a period of economic downturn. But hey, it's a revenue problem. Just keep telling yourself that. So what can we take away from this year's budget? What's the executive summary of this year's budget? Well, the company tax cut is a good thing. I mean, it's a shame that it's phased in over 10 years, and it's a shame that it focuses on the wrong target, because let's be honest about it, small business is being conflated with low-income earners needing some sort of special degree of support, while big business actually drives innovation, jobs and growth. But we'll leave that alone for now. The new work for the dole package will probably start to make people aware of exactly how pernicious the impact of a higher minimum wage is. And if it actually starts to shift long-term unemployment, we'll be able to tell people why. So that's a positive. And spending doesn't massively grow. It's not cut, it's staying at near record levels, but it hasn't physically gone up. And I guess that's a good thing. Unfortunately, of course, there is no plan for surplus. And again, the personal tax cuts do so little to combat bracket creep, they might as well not be there. And now we get to the ugly with a little hat tip to Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach. Look, superannuation. I'm not going to go through the specific measures. People have been doing that for weeks. Basically, the government is going to increase taxes at certain incomes. They're bringing in caps on retirement contributions and tax-free and after-tax contributions. These changes, all of these changes, are solely about raising revenue. They are straight-out tax increases. They do nothing whatsoever to make the retirement system better or even, I think, make retirement itself fairer. Now, some people are up in arms about the retrospectivity, and that's an important point. Some of these elements are retrospective. But that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that the changes to superannuation, the repeated tinkering, all of these little changes over time, none of this will do anything to make people more independent. None of it will boost the number of self-funded retirees. And the issue is, and always has been, the cost of the pension. It is a $50 billion government program, and these super changes do nothing to reduce that cost. So my last point here, and certainly not the least, it's very easy to confuse budget management, fiscal management, with economic management. And that's in part because there's an overlap between the two, right? But fiscal management is about getting the budget house in order. It's about trying to find the budget balance over the cycle. Economic management is about reducing the size and cost of government. You can balance the budget through higher taxes, at least in theory, provided you don't spend all the proceeds. And arguably, in the longer term, it would be better to have a balanced budget through higher taxes than to run a permanent deficit and be overwhelmed by debt. But growing the economy, the vast bulk of the economy that's not government, that is not about balancing the budget at all. Now, in this election, and I'm not going to tell you how to vote, you're all smart enough to do that because you're here, but Labor is proposing methods to grow the economy entirely through bigger government and more government spending. They're spending more on infrastructure, they're spending much more on education, and they're proposing significant levels of protection for industry. The Libs are at least proposing cutting taxes and reducing regulation. At least in some areas, this could be considered a form of smaller government. There are, however, important questions to be answered on both sides, and you can make your own judgments about how serious either party is about the task of economic management or budget reform. But I do ask you, when you're looking at these issues in the election, ask yourself not only who will bring the budget back to balance, but ask yourself who will manage the economy and how, because that matters too, if not more. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, and can I acknowledge my fellow politicians in the room, Senator Bob Day, Peter Phelps, Louise Staley. I don't think Scott Farlow and James Patterson are here, but if they are, I acknowledge them as well. When I was in business, I used to use PowerPoint, and I've given up on it. And I was asking myself, why is that? And I think it's because I've caught the disease that all politicians have. I don't want you looking at anything else. Fix on my face and don't shift. I'm conscious of the fact that it's easy for minor parties to be impractical. When you know you can't win government, you can be as fanciful as you like. And in fact, a valid criticism of the Greens is not only are their policies utterly wrong, but they're pie in the sky. A good example is their proposal to close down the fossil fuel industry. Can you imagine their supporters if they could only charge their smartphones during the day when the solar cells are operating, or when the wind blows enough to operate their wind turbines? But it's also an issue for the Liberal Democrats, my party. We have some rather aspirational policies. They provide hope to those who despair at the illiberalism, taxing and spending agendas of the Liberal and Labor parties. But we need to be practical. We want the Liberals and Labor to steal our policies, or at least be influenced by them. And for that, they have to be feasible. Over the last 3 years, I have published in the Financial Review an alternative budget, about a week or two prior to the actual budget. In the first two, 2014 and 2015, I took quite a radical approach, and I showed how we could not only eliminate the deficit and wipe out our national debt quite quickly, but we could also reduce taxes very substantially. In fact, the intention of those budgets was to indicate that we could implement our tax policy, which is a flat tax of 20% above a $40,000 tax-free threshold, with a company tax of 20% and tobacco, alcohol and fuel excise abolished. Our proposals made economic sense and they're doable, and yet, for some reason, the major parties held back. Not necessarily because they disagree, although I suspect there was an element of that in at least some of the savings. Defunding the ABC and SBS, for example, would give Labor a bit of heartburn, and removing all the corporate welfare, particularly for agriculture, does the same for the coalition. In fact, both sides of politics know what should be done to make Australia a better place economically. What they don't know is how to do it and win an election. Although there are socialists on both sides, most believe in the capitalist economy. They're well aware that growing prosperity is the best way to help people who are falling behind, and the size of the state is a brake on prosperity. I suspect Chris Bowen would like to be a treasurer in the mould of Paul Keating, and I know Scott Morrison would like to emulate Peter Costello. The problem is, as I said, they think they can't sell their ideas to the public. With that in mind, my alternative budget this year was an attempt to show how easy it would be to return to a balanced budget in just 1 year. Doing it over the 4-year period of the forward estimates would be an absolute doddle. Our economy is growing at a healthy 3% and unemployment is at 5.7%, as low as it can be expected given our labour laws. Prices of commodities are lower than what we have enjoyed over the past decade, but they are still higher than they were at any time between 1983, when the Australian dollar was floated, and 2006. And yet, Commonwealth revenue per person this year is around $16,500, while spending per person is $17,900. If we do nothing, bracket creep will boost revenue per person over the next 3 years to around $17,400, while spending will remain at around $17,900. Thus, we would still have a sizable budget deficit, spending would remain bloated, and our tax burden would be even heavier. This cannot continue. And of course, deficits are funded by borrowings. Our net debt, Tim referred to gross debt before, our net debt is around $260 billion and getting worse. An increasing debt burden does a disservice to future generations. And a rising debt to GDP ratio, if not reversed, is a recipe for eventual Greek-style default and disaster. So in my alternative budget, I started from the assumption that increasing taxes was not an option. We now tax smokers, drinkers, high-income individuals, corporations, capital gains and retirement savings more than most other countries in the developed world. We have to reduce spending. What I tried to show was that sharing the pain of spending cuts with everybody and with everybody taking a small haircut with none of that winners and losers nonsense, would be saleable, providing it was presented in the right way. Compared to my alternative budgets in previous years, it was conservative. For a guy like Malcolm Turnbull, who could charm the spots off a cane toad, it should be easy. To put it in context, real spending per person only needs to return to the levels of 2007-2008, which represented the height of the big spending Howard era. Our deficit is around $40 billion. Commonwealth expenditure is about $450 billion. It's only about 9% we need to save. But still, $40 billion in reduced expenditure shared around amounts to $1,400 per person. This couldn't be taken from you without you noticing it. So my budget set out to show where it could be done, without robbing millionaires or leaving pensioners homeless and starving. As you've heard, more than a third of Commonwealth government expenditure goes in welfare, so it's an obvious place to start. In my budget, government spending on welfare should be cut by $300 per person per year, noting that this would still leave $6,000 per Australian. A third should come by freezing welfare payments and childcare subsidies. The aged, families, unemployed and sick would all take a small haircut. Single-age pensioners would miss out on a $20 boost to their fortnightly pension. More than half should come by including the family home in the means test for the age pension. This would ensure young people who can't afford a house don't pay taxes to fund older Australians with valuable houses. Finally, the income test for Family Tax Benefit Part A should apply consistently once a family income reaches more than $50,000. The impact of this would largely fall on families with income in excess of $90,000. Next is health. Government spending of $110 per person should be cut from the health budget. I propose a $5 Medicare co-payment for non-concessional payments and sticking with a $5 increase in co-payments for pharmaceuticals for non-concessional patients. The education budget should be cut by $150 per person. Half could come by requiring graduates to repay their concessional student loans from their first paycheck. The other half could come from reducing Commonwealth funding for students in non-government schools towards the level of Commonwealth funding for students in government schools. The only reason they're different is to counteract state discrimination against non-government schools. Ideally, only one level of government should fund schools using student-linked vouchers, making it irrelevant who owns the school. We can save $10 per person by implementing the Commission of Audit recommendation to remove surplus senior staff at Defence Headquarters. We can save $15 per person by cutting the wages of all Commonwealth Government employees by up to 2%. Public service wages have risen faster than private sector wages since the end of the Howard era. $25 per person is saved by a 20% reduction in assistance to tourism, mining, energy, manufacturing, construction and agricultural industries. A similar haircut for university academics and other government researchers would cut government spending by around $20 per person. A 20% haircut, nowhere near enough, for the ABC, sports, arts and sports funding, heritage and national parks would cut government spending by around $25 per person. Spending of $40 per person should be cut from the Commonwealth environmental initiatives. The direct action plan should be suspended and Abbott's Green Army should be abandoned. Spending of $25 per person should be cut by abolishing regional development spending, which is code for pork barrelling. Spending of $130 per person could be cut by suspending foreign aid, except for short-term responses to natural disasters overseas, which often involve our military. Governments don't need to be involved in foreign aid as long as individuals are able to make charitable contributions to overseas causes they consider worthy. And finally, the states. Spending of $140 per person should be cut by discontinuing Commonwealth spending on affordable housing, because it's a state responsibility, and similarly spending of $410 per person should be cut by discontinuing government involvement in the provision of roads and railways. These are state and local government responsibilities, and Commonwealth involvement is motivated by vote buying. And in any case, in most cases, the state budgets are in a more healthy state than a Commonwealth budget. It's not hard, it's not radical, it is nowhere near what a Liberal democratic government would do. Nowhere near. And you might have your own ideas about some of the individual items, but the point is obvious. It's fair and saleable because it shares the load. All it requires is some gumption. But gumption is also known as courage, and that is in very short supply. Thank you.
Just for Q&A, our volunteers will be holding onto the microphones just to ensure that there aren't problems with the microphones. So try not to grab the microphones off them. Thank you.
My question is, what does it take to give the major parties courage?
We often hear the argument that, or certainly more recently hearing a lot more, is that a term in opposition will give the politicians more courage and what have you. I'm unconvinced by this argument because in Victoria the Liberals were in opposition for over 10 years. And they came back to government just as useless as they had been when they were thrown out the time before. So, unfortunately, it's not quite that clear because there's no incentive to reform their bad ways while they're in office, and when they're in opposition, they don't seem to do that either. I'm actually coming to the opinion that a lot of politicians like being in opposition because they don't actually have to do very much. So it is a challenging question for all of us.
My answer is simple, and it comes down to the voters. Voters do not punish politicians for lying. They do not punish politicians for bringing in budget deficits. They do not punish politicians for wasteful spending. Until they start doing that, the politicians will continue to lie, throw money around and run ridiculous budget deficits. So ultimately, I think it comes down to the individuals. If you start voting for candidates that propose smaller government, if you start punishing people that propose bigger government, the politicians will change. Because for most of them, they don't have any ideological backbone. They're just going where the voters are pointing them.
Thanks. My name's Chris Thanopoulos. If we accept the state with its role in so-called defence, how do we expect to avoid two things that flow from that? First, the historic inability of the state to merely defend its own jurisdiction with its desire to engage in military interventionism overseas. And second, how do we avoid the state seeking approval from the electorate for its existence and military activities by the provision of public health, public education, all the things that you're speaking of now?
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the second question. The first one on defence. I think, to summarise your question, how do you make governments accountable for war, I suppose, for going to war and spending money on defence and getting us into places we really don't want to be? It's more of a complaint about the US government than it is here. I don't think our government is our governments have a history that's particularly bad in that area. But this is one of the very few areas in which I agree with the Greens. I think the decision of going to war, committing our forces to war, should be made by Parliament, not by executive government. The Liberal Democratic Party policy is it requires a 2/3 majority in both houses of Parliament, which would mean it would have to be bipartisan. That's similar to the Greens policy, which is unusual, as I said, for us to agree with them. But the idea is that the executive might be able to say, well, look, we want to go to war, and it might be an emergency. They can do something without requiring parliamentary approval, but that then they can. They have to come back to Parliament to get that decision ratified, and that decision, if it's not ratified, of course, would mean that the executive had to undo its decision, and therefore you would expect the executive to be extremely cautious about committing forces to war if they thought they weren't going to get a majority in the Parliament.
The defence budget's about $30 billion a year out of about $400 billion worth of expenditure. The vast majority of expenditure, about 2/3, goes on health, welfare and education. A lot of people want to talk about defence spending and politicians' salaries and the cost of refugees. None of that stuff is the main issue. The main issue is the direction of huge amounts of welfare and massive increases in health and education spending. That's what's driving the increase in spending and the increase in government. I think we get caught into talking about these minor areas instead of addressing the much bigger areas of government spending and government growth.
If I think I understand your second question correctly, it comes back to an argument as to what is a public good and what is an externality. And I think we can make arguments that, you know, good or bad, but I think there are legitimate arguments to be made that there are some genuine externality issues. We saw this morning dread disease epidemics. This is actually a genuine public health problem that does need to be addressed. But so simply inserting the word public before anything shouldn't automatically give it legitimacy. And I think that we should actually point to some programs and say that is a legitimate expenditure, that is an illegitimate expenditure, and that becomes a moral judgment we make in society.
A question for our panellists, though. Do you think that, just going back to one of the previous things you said, that something has fundamentally changed in Australian politics in recent decades, which means that we can't have some of the necessary reforms? Because there is a lot of writing in the media about politics is broken, politics is dysfunctional, which we've seen with the rise of, around the world of protest movements. Has something fundamentally shifted? I mean, David's nodding, so let's go to...
There's an old saying, never let a good crisis go past. Never waste a good crisis, or something like that, the saying goes. My view is that political change occurs in the face of a crisis, and that's one of the reasons why moral panics come up quite regularly. They are quite often manufactured in order to create a feeling that something must be done. They're often about the wrong things, unfortunately. But if we get a moral panic, a crisis, an economic downturn, and it looks like people are in trouble, political courage is likely to be in greater supply. During the global financial crisis, when the Rudd government was in power, there was a genuine sense of crisis. They didn't know what they were doing, and they did the wrong things, but there was a sense that they had to act and something needed to be done. The current situation with the budget is that, well, it's not a crisis, it's not that urgent. Every time we try to wind back on benefits and entitlements, we copper pasting in the polls. People aren't going to vote for us if we want to take money away from them. So there's nothing we can do. And we end up with the kind of budget we saw last week and the one we saw last year. And then the one in 2014, which everyone thought was radical, which I thought was fairly tepid even so. The government is accused of being heartless and cruel and horrible. That won't change unless there is a crisis. And in fact, I also have a theory that in the argument that only Nixon could go to China, I have a feeling that only the Labor Party will in fact be able to benefit from a crisis, an economic crisis, maybe a world recession or something like that, and fix the budget. They won't be accused of being heartless and cruel to the poor and leaving people behind and all that sort of stuff, even if they did exactly what the Liberals would want to do, because they claim that ground. So I think a crisis will probably be, some sort of crisis will probably be required in order to prompt this budget idiocy, and it's more likely that the Labor Party will take advantage of it.
At the risk of getting on one of my hobby horses, if that is the case and it's only Labor, I think we have a concern. Globally, the left, since the GFC, but also with the rise of inequality politics, the left has really regressed back towards a position of big government and more intervention. If you look at, it's not just Hawke and Keating, although they always get cited, but also the governments in New Zealand, in Canada, even to an extent in the UK, left-leaning governments that introduce pro-market reforms over the periods of decades. That's really what led to a lot of our current economic prosperity. There is very little of that small government, pro-market, pro-growth feeling left in the Labor Party and in the left more generally. It's become much more about redistribution, so-called investment, and also much, much more regulation. And I think until we see a convergence in views on the role of government, we're likely to continue to see a divergence in the budget gap.
I think just coming back to the premise of Tim's question, has it become harder to drive reform and stuff? I think the answer to that question is yes, it has become harder. I think that we are more political, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that's actually a good thing. Politics is not bad, as much as I do like to mock my politician friends. Politics is not bad. This is how we make collective decisions that affect all of us together, and we are actually more inclusive, more discussive. We've got to work harder to get what we want, but that too is not a bad thing either. So yes, things have changed. We are more political, and I think for the better.
Okay, just as a final note, we have 1 minute left, but I think since we do have another federal politician here in Senator Day, if Senator Day might just sort of give a concluding one moment's thoughts on the panel. Sorry to put you on the spot, Senator.
Oh, thank you, Tim. I think for the past 9 years we've been faced with a situation where politicians have been denying that the old adage that anything not based on economic reality is doomed to failure. And they've been in denial on that. And as we know, the reality is that people will do things for their reasons and nobody else's. And this is particularly the case when it comes to workplace regulation. And I think not tackling the fact, and picking up on what Trevor Burrus said earlier, where a lot of people who are not dealt a very good hand in life, you know, they're maybe not very intelligent, they're not well connected, they're not even all that good looking and so on, but there's one card that they can play. There's one card that they have, and that is, I'll do it cheaper. And we take that one thing away from them. And we say, no, because we don't want them to compete with the good looking, well connected, intelligent people. There's just one little anecdote, just to, not in some of the outlying suburbs of Adelaide, a friend of mine had a number of McDonald's stores, and most of the local, young people who worked there came from that local area, and they were not all that bright, not very articulate, and not very reliable, and not good looking, and so on. But they were, they were pretty cheap. And then there was a big push on to raise wage levels for McDonald's workers in that area. And lo and behold, the wages went up, and what happened? All the college kids started applying for the jobs. And my friend who owned these McDonald's stores said, what am I to do? Here's these young, good-looking, well-connected people, intelligent, whose parents dropped them off and picked them up in a BMW, and what am I to do? So all the local kids lost their jobs because the college kids started applying for the jobs at much higher level. I think if we could only fix one problem, and we don't focus enough on this in politics, if we could only fix one problem, it's the old Copenhagen consensus thing, if you only fix one problem in the world and have the most benefit for the most people, what would be that one thing you would do? It would have to be letting people work under terms and conditions which suit them. And I've been to the minister and said, if someone is 70 years old and wants to trade in their pension and go and get a job under terms and conditions that suit them, will you allow them an exemption from the Fair Work Act? And he said, no. I said, what about someone who's disabled? If they know where they can get a job around the corner under terms and conditions which suit them, will you grant them an exemption from the Fair Work Act? And he said, no, and so on. So I think that is the key area that, or we talk about budgets, they won't cut spending, but if you could just allow people to opt out of the workplace regulation system, we'd have a lot less welfare spending, so I think.